Hello and welcome to this training program entitled Preventing Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. My name is Dr. Kathleen Weisberg and I will be your moderator for this session. Let's jump right in because we have a lot of content to cover. Our objectives for this session are to define sexual harassment, identify behaviors that might be considered sexual harassment, explain precautions that employers can take to exercise due care to prevent and correct sexual harassment, and finally, to define employees' rights and roles regarding sexual harassment. So let's start off with some definitions. What is harassment? Well, harassment, more specifically sexual harassment, is illegal. Let's start with that. The Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA, defines sexual harassment as harassment based upon sex or of a sexual nature, gender harassment, and harassment based on things like pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition. It includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. Now, according to the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, sexual harassment occurs when submission to or rejection of this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or even an offensive work environment. They further define sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature under any of the conditions that are listed. Now, submission to such conduct is made explicitly or implicitly as a term or condition of their employment. Submission to or rejection of this conduct is used as a basis of employment decisions that affect the individual, and this conduct has the purpose or the effect of unreasonably interfering with their work environment. Now, the critical piece in all of this is unwelcome. Unwelcome is the critical word. So that is, sexual conduct is unwelcome whenever the person subjected to it considers it to be unwelcome. It depends on the circumstances. So one person might in fact welcome a request for a date or a sex-oriented comment or even a joke, while another person just may not. Now, even though victims may feel pressured to accept certain conduct and actively participate in it, they still may find it offensive, they still may find it objectionable. Now, sexual harassment can take many forms: verbal, visual, physical. We're going to talk about all of this, and does not require sexual desire on the part of the harasser. Now, it could be expressed in a variety of ways, some of which could be really subtle, but all of them are a violation of employee rights, including things like dirty jokes or lewd language, sexual content posted on walls or even on a computer screen or on a phone that might be used for work. Quid pro quo, which we'll talk about. Quid pro quo sexual harassment. This is a request for sexual favors in exchange for an employment benefit of some sort. Sexual favoritism, leering, suggestive looks, inappropriate touching, unwelcome physical proximity, blocking or impeding someone's movement, being denied a promotion or a pay raise because of their gender or their sexual orientation, which we'll talk more about. And finally, unwelcome phone calls, emails, or text messaging. Additionally, unwanted touching. Maybe it's scratching a coworker's back, wrapping your arms around somebody's waist, interfering with an employee's ability to move, any other unwanted bodily contact. Unwanted flirting or asking a coworker for a date that is repeatedly shut down. Sending or posting emails or pictures of a sexual or other harassing nature. Displaying objects, pictures, or even posters that are sexually suggestive. Playing music that is sexually suggestive. Displaying sexually suggestive objects or pictures that are unwelcome, making repeated and unwanted sexual advances to a coworker, and possibly more that we've not even scratched the surface about. Now, is there an impact? You betcha. According to the Journal of Personal Psychology and the International Center for Research on Women, Sexual harassment experiences are associated with a lot of negative outcomes. You can read them right along with me. Decreased job satisfaction, commitment to the workplace, withdrawing from work, having mental health issues or other somatic types of issues, illness, PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. Now, historically, sexual harassment has been identified as one of the most damaging barriers to career success and satisfaction, especially for women. In fact, women are 9 times more likely than men to quit their jobs, 5 times more likely to transfer out of a job, and even 3 times more likely to lose a job because of harassment. And again, the effect on the morale of really all employees can be serious. Both men and women and the workplace can find their work disrupted by sexual harassment, even if they're not directly involved. Sexual harassment can have a demoralizing impact on everyone within range of it, and it negatively impacts company productivity on a whole. So before we go into more detail here, let's talk about Title VII. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's a federal law that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. Now, it generally speaking applies to employers with 15 or more employees, including federal, state, and local governments. It also applies to private and public colleges, universities, employment agencies, labor organizations. Now, despite the fact that this was passed over half a century ago, gender and race discrimination in the workplace is still a serious issue. Now, I'm going to read directly from it, and it says, "It shall be unlawful employment practice for an employer to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin." Now, continuing on, this is just a little bit more language from that. And it just says that it's unlawful employment practice if an employer fails or refuses to hire someone or to discharge someone. So the flip side of that, or otherwise discriminates against somebody in terms of compensation, conditions, privileges, et cetera, based on those factors, race, color, religion, et cetera. It's also unlawful if they limit, segregate, or classify employees or applicants, which in any way would deprive or tend to deprive that person, again, based on any of those factors, race, religion, etc. It forbids discrimination, so including hiring, firing, compensation, transfers, promotions, job advertisements, testing, using company facilities, training, fringe benefits, and that list goes on. So it forbids any sort of discrimination in these areas. And although Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Employment Housing Acts share principles, there are differences. The key points to Title VII, it's a federal law. It protects individuals' race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, national origin, genetic information, etc. And Title VII are for those businesses that employ at least 15 employees or more. Now, I'm just saying that there are differences between Title VII and some of the state laws that are out there. Some of the state laws may have additional protection classifications, additional protections, but this is specific to Title VII. And then finally, it protects any worker who is applying for or working for a Title VII covered employer. And the EEOC is the group within the federal government, that's the federal agency that's mandated to enforce these laws. The beauty of recording. I had to quickly sneeze. Apologies for that. Okay, so let's go into this in a little more detail. So some statistics, some background, some incidents. Approximately 75% of workplace harassment incidents go unreported. Studies show that over 85% of sexual harassment victims never even file a formal legal charge. 72% of sexual harassment victims don't report the incident in any way. Main reasons for that: fear of retaliation in at least 40%, 46% actually to be exact, percent of cases. not wanting to be seen as a troublemaker in 40% of cases, and a lack of trust. There's a high prevalence. Roughly 1 in 10 or 12% of workers have felt sexually harassed at work, with higher rates for women. So we see 17% of women complaining of this and 7% of men. And again, beyond the fear of retaliation, which I again said was 46%, and being labeled a troublemaker, many fear that they're just not going to be believed. That's about 14% of cases. And a lot of individuals have no idea how to report in their particular workplace. So, what are the causes of sexual harassment? Again, these can be really complex and involve a lot of different things: socialization, politics, psychology. Work relationships, we know this, can be intimate, they can be intense, and those involved share common interests oftentimes. Employees are dependent on each other for teamwork and for support. They're dependent on their supervisor's approval for opportunities for career success. Now, supervisors and employers can grow really accustomed to the power that they have over their employees. This closeness, this intensity can sometimes really blur those lines, blur those professional boundaries, and lead people to step over that line. Now, politics too can be a cause, and problems caused by poor management, workplace bullying, frustration, job or financial insecurity. All of these things can create hostile work environments that then spill over into working relationships. Personal problems can also be a factor. Sexual harassment can be a symptom of the effect of maybe a life trauma, such as a divorce, a death of a spouse, or even a child. Now, going back, I already mentioned some of this, but there's basically two different types of sexual harassment that we see. The first is quid pro quo. I already mentioned that earlier on. An employee is subject to a quid pro quo harassment when a term of employment is conditioned upon accepting unwelcome advances of the sexual nature. So quid pro quo basically means something for something. It's a condition for a job, a promotion, a benefit, some fringe benefit, or something. It's based on submission to sexual advances or some other conduct based on sex. Now, in a hostile work environment claim, a little bit different. The employee needs to show that unwelcome comments, unwelcome actions based on sex were severe enough or pervasive enough to interfere with the employee's work performance, or that they created an intimidating, hostile, or even offensive work environment. So quid pro quo, again, supervisor's request for sexual favors results in a tangible job action. So I'll give you the promotion if you sleep with me. I'm going to fire you unless you go out with me. That's very blatantly quid pro quo. Hostile work environment, again, this pervasive nature to create this environment that just makes it a less than appealing environment in which to work. So you might be wondering what types of behaviors actually qualify as harassment and how much is too much to qualify as harassment. So let's talk about that. Some of the types of inappropriate conduct. Now, some workplace conduct is very clearly sexual harassment. Unwanted kissing, touching the breasts, the genitals, the backside, butt slapping, rape, other forms of sexual assault, requests for sexual favors, making sexually explicit comments, uninvited massages, for example, sexually suggestive gestures, catcalls, ogling, cornering somebody in a tight space. All of those would be considered inappropriate conduct. Now, while overt forms of sexual harassment certainly still happen in the workplace, more and more what we're seeing are these subtle forms of harassment. These are on the rise. So, for example, we're going to talk about these. Any of the following things that we're talking about can be sexual harassment. If they happen often enough, they're severe enough to make an employee uncomfortable, intimidated, or distracted enough to interfere with their work. Remember, let's go back to that definition. Unwanted is the clear piece here. So if this is happening and it's unwanted, it is inappropriate and technically could be harassment. So Repeated compliments of an employee's appearance that maybe they didn't want, commenting on the attractiveness of another person, maybe in front of another employee, discussing my own sex life or that person, asking them about their sex life in front of others. Circulating photos. So these could be nude photos. These could be photos of women in bikinis. These could be shirtless men in the workplace. This could be the firefighter calendar that is hanging in the office that somebody doesn't appreciate. Making sexual jokes, sending sexually suggestive text messages or emails, things that have an innuendo about them. Leaving gifts, unwanted gifts of a sexual or a romantic nature. Spreading sexual rumors about someone, or again, some sort of physical proximity. Maybe it's hugs, it's unwanted touching, it's a hand on the employee's back or around their waist or draped over their shoulder. Again, that is unwanted. They don't want that. Now, employees know that complaining about their supervisor or their manager can cause problems at work. I think we all know that. And unfortunately, this is the reality. Many people just put up with it. The sexual harassment by their supervisor, maybe it's the owner, maybe it's the CEO, whatever, of their company, their organization, for months, sometimes years before they speak out, even if they speak out at all. If a supervisor is harassing you, the sooner you contact someone, sooner you let them know, the sooner your rights and your job can be protected. The clear message is, if you see something, if you experience something, say something. Don't wait too long. For sexual harassment claims, managers and supervisors have a really special level of liability. And if you put up with that behavior for months, for years, and then suddenly complain, sadly to say, your employer could use it against you. It's not fair, but oftentimes in a court of law, it works. So, what does supervisor sexual harassment look like? Generally, this is about abusing a position of power. Many times, again, very, very subtle. It builds up over a period of time. So you need to ask yourself if you observed any of the following: inappropriately leaning in too close to you. Maybe your desk and they lean over it to talk to you, or they're getting just a little too close. Unwelcome touching, inappropriate language, dirty jokes. We already mentioned some of that. Consistently asking, what do you do in your evenings? What are you doing on the weekends? Maybe in a suggestive sort of way. Phoning or emailing you at home or off hours. And again, saying things that could be very suggestive. That quid pro quo that we've already talked about, perhaps asking you out on a date. Sexual harassment includes behavior, again, unwelcome advances that make you feel self-conscious, make you feel nervous, afraid, somehow uncomfortable. Now, regardless of how it started or how you initially responded, unwanted advances that persist, that escalate, can lead to a hostile working environment. And soon you want to avoid all interaction with that person. You might even dread coming to work. Now, that harasser, it doesn't have to be a supervisor or an executive. It can be a coworker. It can be a client. It can be a customer. And again, comes in a lot of different forms. Pressure to hang out outside of work or go on a date, come-ons, flirting, comments about your body, or maybe something that you're wearing. Hey, that really flatters your figure. That hugs your shape. Those types of comments. Suggestive language, flowers, cards, gifts, promises of job perks. Again, that quid pro quo. Fondling, hugging, other inappropriate touching, and advances outside of the workplace. And again, perhaps the advances continued even after you told the person, I'm not interested. Perhaps you don't even know how to discourage the behavior. Maybe you don't want to get the person into trouble. You fear that you're going to lose your job. Maybe you've experienced threats. Maybe you've experienced retaliation for refusing the advances. All of this plays out, doesn't make it right. It is still illegal. If it is unwanted, it is illegal. So sexual harassment usually begins again with this very subtle behavior, a comment, an invitation, a tentative touch. But as time goes on, if it's not nipped right then, or we don't recognize it for what it is, harassers will tend to get a lot more bold and they cross that line from unwanted advances or inappropriate touching into sexual assault. A sexual assault in a work setting is both a criminal offense and grounds for a civil lawsuit. Yet, for a lot of different reasons, victims of sexual assault, whether it's in the workplace or not, they feel helpless to do anything about it. They don't say anything. But what's important is you have to stand up for your rights and you have to fight back. It's not right. It is absolutely wrong. So, what is sexual assault? Behavior doesn't have to rise to the level of a forcible rape or something like that to be considered sexual assault. There are degrees of sexual assault, and it can occur even with your clothes on. Second, you need to consider that the law does not consider sexual contact consensual when it involves an employee and a person in a position of authority. So, a supervisor, an executive, an owner, etc. Harassers will often use threats and that power of their position to convince you, the victim, to do something that you otherwise would not normally do. Now, in addition to rape, which we all know is sexual assault, or consensual sex with a supervisor, any of the things that we're going to list on this slide may constitute sexual assault in an employment setting. So, kissing you against your will, lifting your skirt, lifting your shirt, unbuttoning your blouse or a button down, Oxford shirt, whatever. Groping your breasts or your chest or your backside. Again, remembering this isn't just females, this could be men as well. Placing your hands down the front or the back of your pants. Pressing you against you or pulling you onto their lap. Holding your arms, blocking your escape, disrobing or exposure by the person who is the harasser, forcing or coercing you to perform or view any sex act. And sometimes sexual assaults are fueled by alcohol in after-hours scenario, but very often assaults are committed in the workplace by harassers who choose their victims wisely. I don't mean wisely, but they choose them for a reason, and they choose their moments. They look for that specific moment to act. Now let's talk about inappropriate touching. So some people claim to be huggers. I'm touchy-feely, whatever. But no one has the right to hug or touch you if it makes you feel uncomfortable. Unwelcoming touching or of a sexual nature is often disguised as a friendly or maybe even a paternal or maternal behavior. Under the law, though, it could be considered sexual harassment. Now, again, every kid at school, let's back up, we learn about good touch and bad touch, right? But in a work setting, victims of harassment often endure unwanted touching for a lot of different reasons. We say, oh, it's really not that big of a deal. He's just that way, or she's just that way. Am I reading something sinister into something that is really innocent? Am I going to get this person into trouble? And we think all of these things, so the pattern continues, the pattern tends to escalate. Now, it is a big deal, and no one should have to endure it. You trust your instincts. Unwanted touching can take a lot of different forms, like groping, grabbing, caresses, massages, brushing up against you, hugging, kissing anywhere, cheeks, lips, forehead, top of the head, whatever. Sitting or standing uncomfortably close to you, hovering over you while you're trying to work. Now, sexual harassers get a sense of power or thrill from this type of touching, this type of behavior, and they are really skilled at passing it off as being something very innocent. Now, whether it's a supervisor, it's a coworker, whoever it needs to stop. You need to be protected from any further abuse. So we talked a little bit, I mentioned sexual pictures. Now, not everyone finds sexual images entertaining or harmless. You may find them demeaning, disturbing. It may make you feel self-conscious, making it hard for you to concentrate on your job. Again, this is not something that you should have to endure at work. Your employer should not condone it or make you feel like the bad guy for taking offense, for speaking up, asking someone to take those photos down. Now, in a bygone era, those sexy pictures may have been tolerated in the workplace. Today, they are recognized as outright pornography or images that degrade and objectify women or men for that matter. and reinforce outdated gender roles. This can lead to a hostile work environment in which you feel anxious, uncomfortable, intimidated. It also fosters an environment in which other forms of sexual harassment are allowed to gain traction. Now, some of the photos that might be considered harassment or objectionable: centerfolds, nude pictures, cheesecake calendars or posters, pornographic depictions. Now, this doesn't have to be just a photo. This could be a cartoon. This could be a drawing. This could be AI generated for that matter. Sexual pictures that are sent to your work computer, to your phone, and other offensive images of a sexual nature. Now, I mentioned pornography. Pornography has absolutely no place in a work setting. Exposure to pornographic images directly or indirectly can make you feel uncomfortable, objectified, threatened, and creates a hostile work environment. In other words, pornography in the workplace, absolutely a violation of sexual harassment laws. Now, although most employers have a rule against it, viewing online pornography is rampant in the workplace. People are using their work computers, their work cell phones to view pornography. Now, whether it's a coworker or a supervisor who is viewing this, sending it, you have the right to be free from any sort of offensive or sexualized images at work. Now, computer pornography in any form, video, photo, animation, graphic text, could be sexual harassment if they're emailed images or emailed attachments, sexting nude or pornographic images to your cell phone, pornography displayed on a coworker's computer or their screensaver, verbal descriptions of pornographic content, the water cooler talk, we're talking about something, or two or more coworkers gathered around a computer watching pornography. Sexual jokes. I already mentioned this just kind of in passing, but maybe you laugh nervously when you hear these things and you play along. Maybe you wince and you just leave the room. Maybe you protest, and because of that, you've been subjected to backlash. Sexual jokes are not merely inappropriate in the workplace, they can constitute sexual harassment. Now, there's nothing wrong with your sense of humor if you're offended by sexual jokes. They can be graphic, they can be shocking, they can be demeaning, reinforce negative stereotypes. They can make you feel self-conscious, make you feel defensive. They can also be a gateway to unwelcome sexual advances or other forms of sexual harassment. So we start there with what might be perceived a very simple, easy joke, and we progress further. Bottom line, your employer should not allow sexualized jokes or obscene language in the workplace if a reasonable person could possibly be offended or intimidated. Now, sexual jokes that be considered harassment might include things like graphic descriptions of sexual acts, jokes containing sexual language and profanity, sexual innuendo that is aimed specifically at you, sex jokes that are being told maybe in a group or maybe even individually very loudly for everyone to hear. Maybe they're even on the phone or something and they're telling someone else. Sexual jokes or cartoons emailed to your work computer. Now, an issue that can arise in these cases is that the victims have forwarded jokes that were sent to them or engaged in banter in the workplace because they were afraid that they had to try to fit in. Again, you don't have to try to fit in. If it's offensive, you need to speak up. What is it? If you say something or if you see something, say something. By all means, do something. So we talked a little bit about hostile work environment already, but let's deep dive this just a little bit more. Now, to qualify as a hostile work environment, the conduct needs to be offensive not only to the employee, but also to a reasonable person who might be in those same circumstances. So, for example, a female employee might truly be offended that a male employee complimented her haircut and opened the door for her on her way into work. So she might be terribly offended by that. However, the average person probably would not consider that conduct alone to rise to the level of harassment. So one person might be offended, but we have to look at what would a reasonable person expect or experience in that situation. Now, what is it and what can you do about it? Hostile work environments come in, again, a lot of different forms. Some behaviors are going to be very subtle, but that does not keep them from violating your rights, violating other people's rights. So some of these we've already mentioned, but some examples: dirty jokes, lewd language, or offensive language, a lot of curse words, that sort of thing, sexually explicit emails, photos, pictures of or pornography, sexual content that might be posted on the walls, somebody's computer screen, their screensaver, leering, suggestive looks, sexual comments, lewd behavior, inappropriate touching, unwelcome physical proximity to the person, denied promotions, denied pay raises, something like that based on your sex, your sexual orientation, unwelcome phone calls, emails, and text messages. Now, sexual harassment, as we've said, how many times now? At least 15 or 20, takes a lot of different forms, from unwelcome touching all the way up to sexual language. Even the nonverbal gestures can be sexual harassment when that behavior makes the person or makes you feel degraded or somehow threatened. Now, sometimes you have a coworker or a supervisor, whatever, they're trying to be funny. They don't realize that their behavior is, in fact, offensive. However, nonverbal gestures may constitute sexual harassment if the behavior is sexual in nature, makes you feel uncomfortable, even if the gestures are not specifically aimed at you. Now, several examples of sexual gestures that may cross the line into harassment and a hostile work environment include things like hip thrusts, other sexually suggestive actions, hand gestures that simulate sex acts, obscene gestures with the lips or the tongue or somehow in the facial features, simulating groping or touching, using the middle finger in a threatening or a sexual way, body language that's used to corner someone, to trap them, or to threaten them in some way, leering, ogling, suggestive facial expressions, obscene gestures may be a part of offensive behavior, or again, they may be used to silently harass someone without the benefit of having witnesses. It's important, if this is happening, you have to document every instance of this behavior, and it needs to be reported to someone at the organization. Now, some people use profanity and dirty words freely. They have the potty mouth or whatever. Some people use foul language when their emotions run high. Some people use foul language and they think it's funny. In a workplace setting, however, there is no excuse for obscene or sexual language. You should not be forced to endure dirty words or sexual talk that makes you uncomfortable. Now, nobody wants to be labeled as a prude or as a snitch. And instead, many employees just suffer silently when coworkers or supervisors, people in the environment, use explicit or sexually degrading language. Sexual harassment is not merely physical contact or unwelcome advances. It can refer to sexualized language that is so upsetting it creates a hostile work environment. And I'll give you just a personal example. I've been places where I hear individuals dropping, I'm going to use the vernacular, dropping the F bomb repeatedly over and over again in general language. And I'm very offended by that. And I've spoken up, and I don't know, I'm sure I was viewed as the prude, but nonetheless, we don't have to tolerate that. You don't have to listen to that. So again, this language that might possibly cause a hostile work environment: profanity, vulgarity, euphemisms. And I don't know if people say this anymore or not, but boink or screw or the F word again, demeaning terms like bitch or slut or MILF or something like that, crude references to private anatomy, description of sexual acts, comments about your body, or sexual come-ons. Now, sexual harassment, again, does not have to involve physical contact or even a face-to-face encounter. Increasingly, we are seeing sexual harassment in the form of emails, voicemails, texting, or sexting, as it might be called, other electronic communications. And through whatever channel, the effect is exactly the same. It's unwelcome come-ons, sexual comments, offensive messages, all that create this hostile work environment. Now, whether it's electronic or it's in a traditional forum, you do not have to deal with sexualized messages in the workplace. You should not be afraid to turn on your computer, answer the phone, look at a text message that something offensive is going to come across. Now, email, networks, wireless technologies have all expanded work-related communication, but again, has made it really, really easy to be sexually harassed by a coworker, a supervisor, and again, sometimes this happens anonymously. Victims often suffer needlessly here because they're just not even sure, is this sexual harassment? Is it something else? And how do I assert my rights? Instead, what happens is they put up with it. They put up with that demeaning, that threatening behavior until it affects their work performance, their health, other facets of their work life, their personal life. Now, we can determine if sexual notes and other communications are actionable as sexual harassment. It could be communications with sexual come-ons, stalking type of behavior, pornographic images, sexual jokes, explicit language, and this comes through email, instant messaging. So many of us are on different social networking platforms, right? We might see it there. Phone calls, voicemails, text messages that are sent, sexting. We already mentioned that, nude or pornographic images, post-it notes, on a computer screen or on someone's desk, something that of a sexual nature. Other work-related communications, I already said, postings on Facebook, social media, Instagram, what have you. Now, again, you take this to a court of law, the defense is going to try to show that the victim was not offended and willingly participated. And we do know that victims, again, oftentimes will go along with this rather than speak up to make waves, but it's so, so important. If it's happening, we have to say something. Invasion of privacy. This is a totally different situation. Now, have you ever, considered that your employer has videotaped you or photographed you possibly without your permission? Maybe, and I hope this isn't happening, but maybe you discovered or uncovered secret cameras in the employee bathroom. Maybe your employer released private information like your tax records, your medical information, or even explicit photos or videos. Were you threatened with the release of this information? I'm going to release this, I'm going to ruin you unless you perform a sexual act or continue some sort of sexual relationship. Now, invasion of privacy is often very much intertwined with sexual harassment, with one being used to advance the other. Now, whether that illegal conduct was by your boss, a fellow coworker, multiple parties, it is important to know that the law is 100% on your side. You should not have to suffer this extreme intrusion on your privacy, as well as your right to be working in a safe environment. Now, unauthorized intrusion into private matters. This involves the intentional intrusion. These are one of the 4 types of invasion of privacy. I apologize. This involves the intentional intrusion into another person's private life, seclusion, or solitude in some way that is offensive. This has a negative impact on the person. The next type of invasion of privacy is unauthorized public disclosure of private facts. So this involves any disclosure of private information to the public that really doesn't need to be known. A person could have an invasion of privacy claim if that disclosure would be offensive to a reasonable person. Next is misappropriating a person's name or likeness. This is just what you think it is. It's using somebody's name or their likeness in some way to profit off of. And finally, portraying a person in a false light. This happens quite a bit. Making a public statement about someone else that creates this false impression of who that person actually is. And again, that statement needs to be something that would be offensive to a reasonable or an ordinary person. Now, invasion of privacy can, in fact, be a form of sexual harassment. It is one of the most damaging types of sexual harassment because it damages that person's reputation, their personal relationships, and this can include anything from leaking important and private information in order to coerce you into a sexual relationship or secretly recording you in places that are clearly private, such as the restroom. Other types of actions that are considered sexual harassment through invasion of privacy include things like physically invading your personal space, such as your workstation, your desk where you are at work. I already mentioned recording you in the restroom, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be a private area, it could be a dressing room, just some place that you expected to be private, but there's a recording device. Taking your photo or video without your knowledge and then releasing it on the internet via social media or releasing it into the company. Threatening to release confidential information, video, photos, whatever, of a sexual relationship, blackmailing you to conduct sexual acts or engage in a sexual relationship. Now, the most common kind of invasion of privacy claim in the workplace is, again, that unauthorized intrusion into private matters. This could also, again, remember, be just depicting somebody in a false light, monitoring them, stalking them, disseminating damaging rumors about somebody purposefully to damage their reputation. Okay, so let's give an example of a hostile work environment. So we have Elena. Elena is an executive assistant, and her boss, Aaron, frequently asks Elena to join him for dinner after work so they can go over his agenda and other items. They go out fine, and these conversations quickly turn personal when Aaron asks Elena about her dating history, her sexual preferences. Now, during the workday, Elena catches Aaron staring at her for long periods of time while she works. Aaron sends Elena late night texts saying that he liked what she wore to work that day or he can't stop thinking about her. Aaron also makes it a habit of stopping by Elena's office or her desk after everyone else has left for the day to complain about his non existent sex life with his wife. Elena makes it very clear that Aaron's conduct is not appropriate and she tries to leave, she tries to get away, but he stands in front of her in the doorway saying that he just needs someone to be nice to him. Aaron's unwanted attention and sexual conduct continue to escalate over the course of several months. So, this is a very clear cut example of sexual harassment. And what's interesting is that it started kind of innocuously, innocently, join me for dinner, let's go over the agenda, so on and so forth. But then it takes a turn. And she didn't say anything initially, but she was made to feel uncomfortable. And finally, she does. She has to bring this up, she has to say something. So, just a couple of other things to keep in mind about sexual harassment. Sexist comments and actions can also be harassment. A common misconception is that harassment must be of a sexual nature in order to be illegal. However, under Title VII, offensive conduct that is based on an employee's gender and severe or pervasive enough to create an abusive work environment is also considered illegal. So, just as an example, a workplace could be hostile if women are told to be more feminine, if you will, or to live up to other gender stereotypes, or are left out of important meetings. Maybe they have their work sabotaged by male coworkers. Now, sexual harassment by customers or clients. Most people are aware that sexual harassment by a manager or a coworker is illegal. However, under Title VII, an employer has the responsibility to protect employees from sexual harassment by outsiders as well. This is so important. So, depending on the nature of your work, this could be coming from a client or a customer, somebody doing a sales presentation. If you work in healthcare, it's a family member, whatever. Vendors, business partners, the list goes on and on. As long as the employer knows about it or should know about it, that harassment is occurring, they have to take action to stop it. And I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to say it explicitly now. Sexual harassment knows no gender. Traditionally, when we think of sexual harassment, you think of a male harassing a female. And while this is still a very common scenario, plenty of incidents of females harassing males. We also see same-sex harassment, a male against a male or female against a female. That's also illegal. The harassment does not need to be motivated by sexual desire either. Now, some tips here, just some things to do. Again, we have to speak up. So maybe it is contacting a lawyer to figure out what are my rights and what should I do. But at a bare minimum, we need to send a letter, send an email, put it in writing to a manager so your complaint is out there. It is in writing, it is crystal clear that you've brought this up. Make sure it is very clear to your harasser that the offensive conduct is unwelcome. And that does need to be very clear. Make it overt that there is no mistaking that you are offending me by your behavior. You may want to keep a journal if this is ongoing of all of the incidents, dates, details, what's been going on. Don't engage in the behavior. Don't engage in the jokes or the interactions at work because, sad to say, even though it's inappropriate, it's illegal, whatever, in a court of law, unfortunately, it could be used against you that you were going along with it. So do not go along with it. Don't drink. Don't drink alcohol with your coworkers or managers. We tend to see those after hours events at happy hour, at, a party, whatever. That's when a lot of this stuff tends to happen. We'll talk about policies in a few minutes, but obtain a copy of every sexual harassment policy that you have, so that you're familiar with them. You know what the reporting process, et cetera, is for your place of employment. Make a list of all potential witnesses, and these could be anonymous witnesses as well. And if you are experiencing any level of emotional distress, excuse me, depression, anxiety, any sort of psychological mental health types of symptoms because of sexual harassment or sexual discrimination, make sure that you bring this up with your doctor, discuss treatment. Maybe it's counseling, maybe it's therapy, but definitely don't ignore this. Don't let it go on too long, because it's not something that you want to deal with. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to talk about LGBTQIA plus in the workplace. And I realize that just says LGBT, but obviously this includes a lot of different individuals. And this is a very unique sexual harassment scenario. So sexual harassment is a gender neutral offense, as we previously said, at least in theory, right? Men can sexually harass women. Women can sexually harass men, though. However, statistics show that the overwhelming majority of sexually harassment claims and charges are brought by women claiming that they were sexually harassed by men. Now, people of the same sex can also sexually harass each other as long as the harassment is based on sex, rather than sexual orientation, which is not a protected characteristic under Title VII. So, for example, a man's coworkers are constantly bombarding him with sexually explicit photos of women. This makes him feel uncomfortable. He may have a sexual harassment claim. If a man's coworkers tease and belittle him because he's gay, that may or may not be illegal harassment under federal law as it's currently interpreted. Now, that's where, again, you need to know state and federal, because certain states, even certain cities, could consider that very, very much illegal. So again, it doesn't make it right, trust me, but you need to know what your laws are. And the line between harassment based on sex and harassment based on sexual orientation becomes very, very much blurred. So just an example, courts have held that Title VII is violated when a woman is harassed and discriminated against because she doesn't act sufficiently femininely. Similarly, a man who is harassed for having effeminate mannerisms and gestures is protected by Title VII. So again, I guess the message is know the law, know your rights. Even if it doesn't feel right, bring it up. Don't sit on it. Don't wait. Definitely talk about it. Now, workplace rights in the LGBTQIA plus community are a bit of a gray area, since sexual harassment in the workplace has always been associated with unwelcome male and female content. And again, this community gains the same rights as heterosexual counterparts. People who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc., are now protected from unwelcome sexual advances in their place of work. And unfortunately, the LGBTQIA plus community is at higher risk of sexual assaults as they've been stigmatized and marginalized for decades. Violence that is really motivated by hatred toward individuals of different sexual orientations transfer over to that workplace, and it often takes the form of sexual assault. Internalized homophobia, the shame that comes with it, affect this community as a whole. However, while sexual violence experienced by the LGBTQIA plus community has become a hot topic, ways to prevent it, not so much. It's not something that we discuss quite a bit. And again, that's changing so much as state laws are being introduced to really protect the entire community. And one example there is California law. California law is really way past, way ahead, is what I want to say, of other states in protecting the community. So you might be interested to know about the incidents related to this. Roughly 1 in 3, so 34% of LGBTQIA plus employees have experienced at least one form of discrimination or harassment at work. Within just this past year, 11% of LGBTQIA plus employees have experienced discrimination, 12% have experienced harassment. And then if you look at transgender employees, over half of transgender employees report being fired, 54%, or not hired, 53%, based upon their LGBTQIA plus status. Continuing on, LGBTQIA plus employees face high rates of workplace harassment, with over 50% reporting bullying or harassment, up to 37% experiencing it due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Transgender employees are especially vulnerable, 47% experiencing harassment in the last year. And some of the common forms of this include verbal harassment, 30%, sexual harassment at about 22%, and physical harassment sitting at about 16%. And there's fear. Fear prevents a lot of folks from bringing their full selves to work. Nearly 3/4, 70% of non-LGBT employees believe it's quote unquote unprofessional to discuss sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace. LGBTQIA plus individuals often cover up, or downplay aspects of their authentic self. They hide their personal relationships. They change the way they dress. They change the way they speak in order to avoid some form of discrimination. We also see that when applying for jobs, LGBTQIA plus individuals often conceal information about their sexual orientation or their gender identity from their resumes in order to avoid bias, in order to avoid that discrimination, especially individuals of color, 12%. Individuals with disabilities, almost 16%, and young people between the ages of 18 and 24, and that's sitting at about 19%. Now, again, those individuals, talented employees, are leaving companies because of this issue. They don't feel welcome. LGBTQIA plus employees are more likely to report experiencing bullying, public humiliation, embarrassment, as compared to their non-LGBTQIA plus counterparts. So, sorry about that. Continue on. Let's just give you a few examples of, so I just mentioned all of these numbers, right? But there are stories behind that as well. And some of these are a little bit older, but behind these statistics are some heartbreaking stories of everyday Americans who have lost their jobs based on characteristics that have nothing to do with job performance. So again, this story is a little bit on the older side, but Vandy Beth Glenn, a real person, lost her job with the Georgia General Assembly when her boss fired her because she was transgender. And I'm going to quote her and read directly. "My boss told me I would make other people uncomfortable just by being myself. He told me that my transition was unacceptable. And over he told me it was inappropriate. Then he fired me. I was escorted back to my desk, told to clean it out, then marched out of the building. I was devastated." Another person, real person, again, Brooks Waits, gainfully employed in Dallas, Texas, until her manager fired her immediately when she saw a picture on Brooks' cell phone of Brooke kissing her girlfriend on New Year's Eve. And did you see the eye roll just there? I didn't lose my job because I was lazy, incompetent, or unprofessional. Quite the contrary. I worked hard and did my job very well. However, that was all discarded when my boss discovered I am a lesbian. In a single afternoon, I went from being a highly praised employee to out of a job. Just mind boggling, right? And in another example, Officer Michael Carney was denied reinstatement as a police officer in Springfield, Massachusetts, because he told his supervisors he was gay. Quote, I'm a good cop, but I've lost 2.5 years of employment fighting to get that job back because I'm gay. I'm proud to be Irish American. I'm proud to be gay, and I'm proud to be a cop. So again, these things are still happening out there. We need to prevent them from happening. The unfortunate reality, too, though, is that there are possible economic consequences. Gay and transgendered individuals can suffer socioeconomic inequalities, in large part due to pervasive discrimination in the workplace. Discrimination directly causes job instability. It causes high turnover. It results in greater unemployment, possibly poverty rates for gay and transgendered individuals, as well as what might be perceived as a possible wage gap between gay and straight individuals. Now, really depends on what research you're reading. Some studies have demonstrated that gay men earn 10% to up to 32% less than similarly qualified heterosexual males. But on the flip side, there are studies out there showing that they earn 10% more. So that might be geographically represented or maybe within a specific state. What's important, though, is that companies should really care about these numbers if they're in the business of boosting profits, and I assume most are. Time and again, researchers have demonstrated that discrimination in any way diminishes productivity, job satisfaction, and both the mental and the physical health of all employees. Now, again, any person of a different sexual orientation who is sexually assaulted in the workplace or discriminated against based on their sexuality has that right to press charges according to more recent employment laws. Some of the incidents that can trigger an investigation in this regard include things like using intimidation tactics that create a hostile work environment, harassing workers on being too masculine or too feminine, retaliation for asserting legal rights in the workplace, hiring, firing, demoting, or laying off a worker because of their sexual orientation, and finally, eliminating benefits based on sex or failure to pay LGBTQIA plus workers because of their sexual orientation. Okay, so what is the requirement? What are the requirements, for the employer? So let's go through that and let's talk a little bit about policies. Now, if you are an employer or obviously you work for an employer, you have the responsibility, the employer has the responsibility to maintain a workplace that is free from sexual harassment. That is their legal obligation. But let's think about it. It also makes really good business sense, right? If they are going to allow sexual harassment to flourish in their workplace, they're going to pay a pretty high price. It's employee morale, it's low productivity, it's lawsuits, it's reputation. Who's going to want to work for you if that is the culture of your organization? Now, furthermore, if a court finds that employers have violated Title VII, that court could order the employer to pay back. They could have compensatory damages, punitive damage, etc. They may also order appropriate injunctive relief. So, for example, a court can enjoin the employer from continuing discriminatory workplace practices, such as maintaining a formal policy of treating women differently from men for no bona fide reason based on the requirements of the job. Excuse me. Now, despite Title VII's mandate against sexual harassment in the workplace, there remains some disagreement among federal courts, especially among federal district courts within the First Circuit, as to whether supervisors may be sued in their individual capacities for sexual harassment. Now, this controversy results from the statute's arguably ambiguous definition of the term employer. Now, although Title VII's language addresses explicitly an employer's conduct, it defines the term employer to include employers with certain characteristics and any agent of such a person. It's this any agent clause that causes the courts to really disagree about whether or not supervisors can be sued in their individual capacities. Some courts will interpret that and any aegis as unambiguously providing for individual liability of supervisors. Supervisors are common law agents of the employer, after all. They are reasoning. So, again, it's really going to depend on the court. The other piece is that even if the court doesn't see them as the employer, that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't go after that supervisor in a civil suit of some sort. So let's talk about the employer's obligations. Under the law, all employers are required to take the following actions against harassment. First, take all reasonable steps to prevent discrimination and harassment from occurring. I hope we're doing this, of course. Develop and implement a sexual harassment prevention policy, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, with a procedure for employees that they know how to make complaints. How does the employer investigate those complaints? And the policies need to include provisions to fully inform the person who is complaining, the complainant, of his or her rights, including the right to be free from retaliation, any obligations to secure those rights. The policy needs to talk about full and effective investigations. The investigation needs to be thorough, objective, complete. Anyone with information regarding the matter should be interviewed. Any determination must be made and the results communicated back to the person who made the initial complaint, to the alleged harasser, and as appropriate, anybody else who might be concerned or directly involved. Now, additionally, the employer has to take prompt and effective corrective action if those harassment allegations are proven that they actually happen. The employer has to do something. They have to take action to stop the harassment, make sure that it is not going to continue. The employer also needs to communicate to the complainant that the action has been taken to stop that harassment from reoccurring. And finally, appropriate steps need to be taken to remedy any complainant's damages if, in fact, there are any. Now, also, we need to make sure that the employer does the following. They forbid sexual harassment, and that kind of sounds like a no-brainer, but they have to declare that all forms of discrimination, including sexual harassment, will not be tolerated in their workplace. They need to define the prohibited conduct, explaining what sexual harassment is and define the two forms, the hostile work environment and the quid pro quo that we talked about. They need to provide examples of prohibited harassment, so describing hypothetical workplace situations involving the harassment. Note that the harassment may involve spoken or written words, images, or physical conduct. And this is where maybe some role plays or some case studies, which we're going to do in just a few minutes, might take place. They need to have a catch-all sentence or a catch-all phrase after providing those examples, stating that that list is just illustrative and does not include all possible incidences that may lead to investigation and possible disciplinary action. They need to prohibit harassment based on characteristics other than sex. So they might want to make that broad policy enough to apply harassment that is not sexual in nature, based on race, color, national origin, religion, creed, disability, age, marital status, sexual orientation. They have to apply their policies to all employees, regardless of position or title. The policy can also be applied to anyone who has a relationship with the employer, such as a vendor, a contractor, or a volunteer. It needs to prohibit retaliation. This is a serious issue. Even though sometimes we say there is no retaliation, we have an anti-retaliation policy, we still see it. And if we see it, they have to take action. The policy must strictly prohibit any sort of retaliation against an employee who complains of harassment. It needs to encourage reporting of instances of retaliation. Any policy needs to outline the investigative procedures. So outline the employer's process. How do we investigate sexual harassment complaints so that employees know if I make a complaint, this is what I can expect. Additionally, they need to adopt this clear sexual harassment policy. So those are kind of the elements of what they need to do, but it needs to be in the handbook, and there is a very specific section policy, whatever it is. dedicated or devoted to sexual harassment. That policy, and again, we already mentioned some of this, it needs to define what is sexual harassment, state in no uncertain terms that you will not tolerate sexual harassment, that you will discipline or fire any wrongdoer. So they need to know what the disciplinary action is, what to expect. Set out a very clear procedure for how do we file a complaint? Who do I go to? What do I do? Who do I talk to? How is that? Can it be made anonymously, etc.? State that you are going to investigate fully any complaint that you receive, any and all, even if you think there's no merit to it, every single complaint needs to be investigated. And then finally, state that you will not tolerate retaliation against anyone who complains about sexual harassment. So that becomes a serious issue too when there is a complaint, maybe nothing was founded, and then we see retaliation. Gosh, you smeared my name, you dragged me through the mud, whatever. It can't happen. There is no retaliation. Employee training is important as well, at least once a year, whether that's through compliance training, through role playing, whatever it happens to be. Training sessions for employees need to occur. They need to teach employees, again, what is sexual harassment, explaining that the employee has a right to a workplace that is free from sexual harassment. It reviews that company's complaint procedure, encourages employees to use it, how to use it. Also, we need to train supervisors and managers. And just as an offside here, there are, within the country, I can think of states, I can think of cities that require supervisors and managers to have this training as well as employees. And the supervisor and manager training takes on a very different flavor. So again, know what your laws are, know what your local requirements are as well. But for supervisors and managers, again, at least once a year, those training sessions need to happen, and they need to be separate from what's happening with the employees. So they would sit in, obviously, on both, and educating managers and supervisors about sexual harassment, how to deal with complaints, how are we addressing this. We train our managers too, offering that additional training for them, how to prevent harassment by them, of course, but also their subordinates. How do we handle those complaints? The potential for personal liability, possibly for their own actions in addressing sexual harassment. And again, even if your state, your town, your municipality, whatever, doesn't require or suggest training, this is still a really good idea. Your managers need to know what is the law, what do they do, particularly when an employee complains? What if you find yourself in a lawsuit? You need to be able to show that you took all of the steps necessary to try to prevent that harassment. So talking about prevention, we might have a prevention or a response checklist. Again, a clear and effectively implemented anti-harassment policy and complaint procedure will help employers to prevent this from happening in the first place. Prevent those complaints, encouraging the employees to come forward when they experience it. This checklist really serves as a roadmap, if you will, for responding to complaints, provides an effective defense in litigation over harassment claims. Now, disseminate and implement that policy. We already talked about the policy. No matter how well drafted that policy is, it's not going to prevent anything if it's not been disseminated. You have to hand it out. You have to widely implement it. So it needs to be distributed to every single employee, ensuring that the policy is, again, in the handbook, in onboarding, annual compliance training, whatever it takes, make sure it gets out there. Additionally, employees need to acknowledge the policy. Maybe they sign an acknowledgement. Maybe it's done electronically, stating that they received it. They're aware of it. They don't necessarily have to agree with it, though I don't know why they wouldn't. What you're asking them to acknowledge is that you gave it to them. They have it. They're aware of it. You also need to post the policy, or you should post the policy prominently on a bulletin board throughout the workplace, on your website, maybe your internal website, whatever that happens to be, and make sure, again, that everybody sees it. And then finally, investigating. You investigate, you resolve sexual harassment complaints promptly, thoroughly, impartially. Promptly is really important because if we don't get after it immediately, it's only going to snowball. We have a lot more options to us in resolving an issue if we jump on it the first time we hear about it. Now, there are obligations of a company too after a complaint is made. So, when an employee complaint comes forth, somebody says, I'm experiencing sexual harassment, there are legal, there are ethical, there are employee relations obligations that they have to go through to thoroughly investigate those charges. So, first and foremost, before a complaint is filed, the organization should make sure, as we just said on the previous slide, that that policy is posted. Everyone is informed of what the organization's policy is relative to sexual harassment. It's not going to be tolerated, and it absolutely will be investigated. Then we map out a plan. A plan is mapped out that covers the important people, the situations to investigate in that initial complaint. So this basically involves planning the investigation based on what we currently know about the situation. Next, we're going to talk to the employee. Oops, sorry about that. Sorry about that. Next, we're going to talk with the employee who is actually complaining. Guarantee that employee that they are safe from retaliation and that reporting the incident or the general situation was absolutely the appropriate action to take. Inform the employee that you need to know immediately about any retaliation, reported retaliation, any ongoing harassment that that person is experiencing. Again, you ask that employee to tell the whole story in his or her own words. You listen, you take notes, you write down the relevant facts, dates, time, situations, witnesses, anything that seems relevant. And as you're taking those notes, this is your opportunity to reflect back. Okay, what I'm hearing is this. If I'm understanding you correctly, that. Just again, making sure that you have all of the information and that you understand the information. You're going to tell the person who was accused that a complaint has actually been filed and that no acts of retaliation or any unethical actions will be tolerated. You ask that person to be patient while you conduct a thorough investigation. You assure the person who is accused that a fair and just investigation will be conducted on their behalf, as well as that of the accuser. And, that's a really hard one. Here's this person who could possibly be guilty. They could possibly be innocent. Who really knows? And they're sitting there waiting, what's going to happen to me if in fact they are innocent? So you have to let them know that while you're investigating, I have your interests at heart as well. Hold on a second. There we go. So interview the person who is accused of sexual harassment. And again, you're going to apply those same listening skills, that same respectful approach that you gave that person who filed to this person as well, to any other witnesses. Hearing what they're saying, writing it down, reflecting back. Review all of that information and attempt to reach a decision. Make the best decision you can with the information that you have, and you make a decision. And this is again where it might be challenging. Sometimes this goes to your compliance department or a compliance hotline. Maybe it's an ethics committee or something. And, sometimes it's very difficult for just one person where these situations are a little bit trickier to make that decision. So we might need to pull in one or two other people to help us with that. Then you make a decision. You make a decision about whether or not you really feel like sexual harassment occurred. Provide the appropriate discipline to the appropriate people based on your findings. That might be suspension, that may be termination, who knows? Maybe you need to make some work or assignment setting adjustments as necessary. Maybe that person stays on in some way, but we reassign somebody to a different department. Recognize too that no one's perfect. No situation can be perfectly investigated. Even when harassment may have actually occurred, there may be no facts, no witnesses, nothing that corroborates that complainant's statement. And assure too, of course, that no further incidents occur by following up. You document that follow-up with the employee who made that original claim, and you keep that documentation separate from their personnel file. This needs to be confidential. And of course, remember that it is possible that the employee has been wrongly accused. So give that person, again, that same courtesy of following up, documenting the same way that you would the person making the complaint. Adjust those working situations too fairly where necessary for the comfort and the productivity of everyone. Now, all employers should be made aware of the seriousness of violations of sexual harassment in that policy. We need to be cautious against using peer pressure to discourage harassment victims from complaining. And we do. Sometimes we do get that peer pressure. Oh, you shouldn't say anything because you're going to ruin their career or this is going to happen to them. If harassment occurs, we take effective action to stop any further harassment. We correct any effects of the harassment. A program to eliminate sexual harassment from the workplace is not only required by law, but it is the most practical way for an employer to avoid or limit their liability, especially if harassment should occur despite everything you've done to prevent it. Now, all employers, regardless of the number of employees, are covered in certain situations in certain states. So again, we want to make sure that we know what is our requirement, what does our state say, what is federal. Again, we're required to take all reasonable steps to prevent harassment from occurring. If the employer fails to take those measures, that employer is going to be held liable for that harassment. The victim could be entitled to damages, even though no employment opportunity has been denied. There's no loss of pay, there's no loss of benefit. If an employer knows or should have known that even a non-employee has sexually harassed an employee, an intern, an applicant, a person providing services, whatever, and they fail to take immediate action, the employer could be held liable for even the actions of the non-employee. I mean, again, this is serious, serious stuff. Employers need to have those policies, follow those policies, disseminate them, and do everything they can, obviously, to prevent. So remember, this is kind of my catch-all slide, if you will. Persons of any gender can be victims of harassment. Harassers can be any gender and can harass people with the same gender, different sexual orientation, same sexual orientation as their own. Sexual harassment in the workplace can be perpetrated by a supervisor, a coworker, or someone in the workplace at the invitation of the employer, such as a contractor or a vendor. Sexual harassment in educational institutions can be perpetrated by any representative of the institution, such as an executive, faculty, administrative staff member, or even a teaching assistant. Sexual harassment is not limited to any level of employment or education. Critically important, you need to know your company's policies. Employers, remember, are required to post. Workers have the right to employment free from sexual harassment or unlawful discrimination. In many states, this is considered a civil rights violation, and in most states, employers are required to post information on premise and in that handbook. Be free from unlawful discrimination or sexual harassment in the workplace, file a charge of discrimination or sexual harassment, and of course, to obtain certain reasonable accommodations, such as those based on pregnancy or disability. The ignorance of the law excuses no one. You need to know that law. Remember that training and education are going to be the best prevention in every situation. And again, remember, you are protected if you are a whistleblower. So if you bring it up, if you complain, if you see something, you report it, there is a no retaliation policy. Okay, so we're coming toward the end here. Let's go through a couple of case studies, and I'm going to pause on each one of these. There's not necessarily right or wrong answers to this, but some things that I want you to consider. So you want to consider, as we go through each of the situations, is this situation problematic? Why or why not? Why is it problematic? Why is it maybe not problematic? What are the primary issues at hand? How might you reconcile this situation if this employee came to you and brought up this situation? What additional information would you require to assess the situation? So put yourself in the position of the supervisor here. What might happen if you do nothing? What should you do next? Okay, so just keep some of those in mind as we go through a couple of these scenarios. The first one, oh, that's just Bob. So Bob is an employee in a department And he regularly tells off-color jokes. He's rude to his coworkers. He nicknames them derogatory names behind their backs, and he uses sexual and racial slurs. He's made some of these comments in front of his supervisor, Dale. Now, his coworkers are upset by the conduct, but feel that since Dale hasn't done anything about it, they just have to put up with it. Joan, a new employee, approaches Dale to complain. Dale tells her that Bob is a really good worker and he doesn't mean anything by the comments. That's just Bob. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just think about this. Is this a problematic situation? Why or why not? What are the issues? How might you address this? What else do you need to know? So I'm going to give it maybe just about half a minute to think about that before I give you my thoughts on this. Okay. Is it problematic? Yeah, it's problematic. It's problematic in a couple of different ways, I believe. First, you have Bob, who is doing this. He has racial slurs, sexual comments, what have you. So there's inappropriate behavior in the workplace at a bare minimum. The other piece, though, is you have this supervisor, Dale, who has done nothing about it, who has seen it and maybe is one of the good old boys and just kind of goes along with it. And because of that, Dale is essentially creating what is a hostile work environment because people are putting up with it. The other thing at play here is that Joan now is actually complaining, and Dale isn't even taking her complaints seriously. That's a problem. So Joan has a right to complain, whether that's a hostile work environment, whether she feels it's sexual harassment, whichever direction she wants to go here. We absolutely have to do something here. So if you were a supervisor here, I think you would nip this. You would talk to him about it first as a performance issue. If it continues, then of course we need to take a little more drastic action. Okay, so definitely some issues there. Okay, let's look at a second one. So we have possibly a culture-based miscommunication. So we have Pam. Pam is a staff member, regularly engages in friendly small talk with Ahmed, who is another employee. Ahmed's culture is a little more formal with defined rules for male and female interactions. He views Pam's conversations with him as a romantic interest. Well, one day, Ahmed hugs Pam and discloses his attraction toward her. Pam is really upset and files a complaint. Ahmed is shocked by the complaint. Pam stresses that she just wants him to stop because she's not interested in him. So think about this one. Is this situation problematic? Why or why not? What are the issues at hand here? And if you were, the supervisor or the manager, how might you reconcile this situation? So I'm going to give you a minute to kind of think on that one before we move on to the next situation. Okay, so is this situation problematic? Yes, it is, because we have a situation here. There is a miscommunication of some sort. Is it sexual harassment? I would venture to say that possibly it is not. Because remember, let's go way back to our initial slides where, something happens in the workplace. It might be very, very offensive to one person, but if a reasonable person would not think that it is offensive, then it possibly isn't sexual harassment. So you could go a couple different ways here. So he is conversing with her. She doesn't like it. It's conversation. Now, once he gets to this point where he hugs her unwantedly, that could seriously be an issue there. This is clearly a miscommunication. He has a different cultural background than she does, if we can get on a culturally level playing field, I think we could resolve this quite easily. If he's hugging her, if he goes forward and he's doing things against her wishes, yes, that could be observed or perceived as some sort of sexual harassment. But again, we need to get on that level playing field. So hopefully that makes sense there. So that's a little bit of a gray area for this particular example, again, because a reasonable person may not, if they have a relationship that is a good relationship, may not consider that hug to be offensive. Again, it really depends on how that hug too is out there. Oh, I'm so happy for you. Oh, that's really awesome. It's good to see you. And we hug somebody versus like, I just walk up to you and hug you. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, okay, moving along. We have the office party is our next one. Marianne is the supervisor in a department. She reserves a private room at a local restaurant for the department holiday party. At the dinner, one of the employees, Eric, becomes inebriated and starts loudly commenting on female staff members' physical attributes, including the size of their breasts. The other staff members have been drinking as well. They laugh at the comments. Marianne witnesses the conduct, but doesn't want to ruin everyone's fun. Besides, Eric behaves this way at every holiday party. Oh, that's just Eric, right? The next day, Marianne is approached by Derek, a new employee faculty member who tells her that Eric's behavior has gone too far. So think about it. Is this problematic? Why or why not? What are the primary issues and what might you do about it? So pause for a moment just to think about that. Okay. Is this problematic? You betcha. This is definitely problematic. Remember, we talked about on the early slides, don't drink. Don't drink with your coworkers. It tends to get us into trouble. So he was drinking. And remember, we said about making comments loudly enough for other people to overhear could be considered sexual harassment. So this is definitely a case of that. The problem is everybody's just kind of laughing it off, saying, oh, that's just, this person. And Marianne, as the supervisor, doesn't do anything. She doesn't step in. That's even more problematic. She needs to step in right there at the holiday party, pull Eric aside and say, your behavior is unacceptable. This is what you're saying. I am not going to tolerate this. I'm going to call you an Uber or a cab and I'm sending you home. And we'll talk about this again tomorrow. By not addressing this, she has now created in her workplace an environment or a culture of mistrust, a culture of disrespect that we don't want. We certainly don't want. His behavior has gone too far. It does need to be addressed. Just because it's historical, just because he's always done it, doesn't make it right. And then finally, one last one, an employee scorned. Two employees who work part-time in a rehabilitation therapy department are having trouble getting along while at work. Their supervisor interviews both of them. Both report that they used to be great friends and often went out for beer together after work. The male student asserts that the tension resulted from his rejection of the female student's sexual advances. He claims that ever since he rejected her, she has said nasty personal things to him and about him to other members of the team, creating a hostile working environment. The female employee says that the tension resulted from the male employee's condescending attitude and disrespect for her at work. She claims that he belittles her and denigrates everything she does in the gym. Is this situation problematic? So let's just jump right in. Yeah, it absolutely is. You have two people who are not getting along here. But what's interesting about this one is that both of them have a story, and both of them, that story is considered some level of harassment. The male is saying, she came on to me and I said no, and this tension has occurred. She's saying, yeah, this tension is coming about because he's condescending. He wants me in these traditional female roles, and that's not who I am, and he belittles me. So there's two situations going on. It almost kind of sounds like both of these individuals are at fault. We'd have to really investigate this one to see what's going on, but again, take the role of the supervisor. What do? You are going to investigate. You're going to get both sides of the story here. Try to determine what is accurate, what is truthful, what is going on. It may require some work reassignment. We may find that both of them are at fault, but to the degree that we keep both of them on and we just reassign, or both of them are not at fault, but they can't work together, so we reassign. So a lot at play there. Okay, let's finish this up. And I love this slide. It's probably my favorite slide. It's a simple litmus test, just thinking about what is happening. Would you say that? Would you do that in front of your spouse, in front of your grandparent? Would you want this to be said to your spouse, your significant other, your child, your daughter, your son? Would you want it published online? Would you want it in the newspaper? It's a simple litmus test, right? If you are being harassed, if you are the harasser, stop it immediately. If you're being harassed, report it. Think about what you're saying. And again, if you don't want it, if you wouldn't do it in front of all of these other people, you probably shouldn't do it in the workplace. Stop it immediately. Rules to live by. Respect the rights of your coworkers. Practice 24-hour-a-day professionalism. When you look at those scenarios and you look at some of those situations, it really comes down to professionalism in the workplace, around your coworkers, around your peers, around your supervisors. Understand that, oh, I didn't mean any harm by it. That doesn't save you in a court of law. Ignorance of the law is no justification, or ignorance of what harassment is. Just because you didn't mean anything by it doesn't mean that I can't find it offensive. And don't be that person. Just don't be that person who is the toucher or the hugger, the person who does, the racial jokes, the sexual jokes, that off-color stuff. They make those comments, etc. Just don't go there. Keep it professional and keep it in check in the workplace. Okay, that's a lot of information in just a very short amount of time. So I do hope that you got something out of this and have a little bit better understanding of what sexual harassment is, what we do tolerate, what we don't tolerate, and sometimes where those gray lines come in. So this concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for participating. Should you have additional questions, comments, what have you, my contact information is right there on the slide, and I would be more than happy to answer any sort of additional comments or questions or more information that you need. Thank you again for your participation.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.